Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Carroll. I am with the Florida Sheriff's Association, and we're very appreciative that you would join us here today as we launch the Don't Let Florida Go to Pot Coalition. We have a variety of members in this coalition, and we're here to talk about how the legalization of marijuana is going to change the face of Florida. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Sheriff Grady Judd.
Thank you very much. As you may well know, I'm the president of the Florida Sheriff's Association this year, so I get to lead this charge for the Florida Sheriff's Association. Amendment 2 is on the ballot for November. Amendment 2 is about legalization of marijuana. This is not about the medical use of marijuana, it's about legalization of marijuana. And this amendment, in fact, is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Our folks that are pushing this position tell you it's medicine for the very sick. When's the last time you went to the doctor and they gave you some medicine and said, smoke this till you feel better? When's the last time you went to a doctor and as you drove in, there was somebody with a sign saying, physical examinations, $40. Ladies and gentlemen, we at the Florida Sheriff's Association and the Florida Sheriffs across the state of Florida are not here to tell you how to vote. We're here to educate you before you go to vote. And I can tell you from speaking throughout the community, when I ask how many people have read this constitutional amendment, that virtually no one raises their hands. It's wrought with loopholes. It's very cleverly written so that there can be use and abuse. And let me give you some examples of the issues, the law enforcement issues we think we'll face. Many of the 21 states that pass legislation on medical marijuana are experiencing many, many challenges. One of these challenges is an increase in crime rate. Now, there's some areas that you may say, well, crime's gone down. But let's look at Colorado. In 2001, they legalized marijuana. And in the first 3 years, their violent crime increased by 13%. The Los Angeles Police Department reported that between 1996 and 2009, according to our Heritage Foundation, that's our source, there was a 200% increase in robberies, 52% increase in burglaries, 57% increase in aggravated assaults, and 131% increase in car burglaries near dispensaries. Then I went a step further in my community and I said, let's look at the population of Orange County, California, and how many pot dispensaries they have, and let's extrapolate the data according to our community. And when you look here, if we had no more or no less pot dispensaries than Orange County, California, there would be 50 in our county alone. Now think about that. We only have 31 McDonald's. And we would have 50 pot dispensaries. Florida's worked hard keeping crime at a 43-year low. And I can tell you unequivocally, because we deal with crime every day that is marijuana related, but as a matter of routine, when we do press releases or when the media covers that, we don't ever talk about, oh, this was marijuana related. This was marijuana related. Just last night, our deputies arrested a man with a firearm, carrying it illegally. But guess what else he had in his possession? Marijuana. And he had other drugs. So we hear people say, and as recently as this weekend, when we released the fact that a man threw an infant against the wall, breaking the infant up, leaving the infant in critical condition. And we interviewed him. He said, man, I smoked a blunt and a half. The baby kept me awake all night long. And so we put that out. And immediately people said, well, he had to be on something other than marijuana. Well, maybe he was. He didn't admit that. But bingo, marijuana is not a single subject matter. It's a crime matter. It's a social problem matter. It's a social community matter, and certainly it leads to other drugs. And for those that think drug cartels won't still be alive and well, you're wrong. Their goal will be to undercut the marijuana market because they still intend to make their profit, regardless of whether or not marijuana is legalized. So at the end of the day, and at the end of the speeches I give, I ask the people one question. How many of you want to pay more in taxes? And I've talked to hundreds of people in my community so far. Not one of them raises their hands. And I tell them clearly and unequivocally, you will pay more taxes because it's going to take law enforcement and policing and regulation. There's unintended consequences that none of us even think of. There'll be lawsuits about why we don't allow marijuana in the county jail as a medicine if it passes. There'll be lawsuits to defend. And then if we lose those lawsuits, guess what? You'll directly pay for medical marijuana for people in the county jail. So at the end of the day, marijuana is not good for Florida. The beaches are good for Florida. The kids coming to Florida on vacation to the greatest attractions in the world are good for Florida. Marijuana's not good for Florida. We're going to provide an educational component all through this campaign. And then we're going to tell you, we're your servants. We'll do what you say. However you vote, we'll abide by that and make it work the best we can. But we want you to go in understanding there's large loopholes, and your child can obtain marijuana without your knowledge with this loophole. And there are dangers and there are unintended consequences. And then we'll let the people of the state of Florida cast their vote. Calvina?
Good afternoon. I am Calvina Fay. I'm the Executive Director of Drug Free America Foundation and Save Our Society from Drugs. And we are proud partners of the Don't Let Florida Go to Pot campaign. We share concerns of many on this issue. It is a constitutional amendment. It is fraught with a number of loopholes, and we're very concerned about it. For example, Governor Jerry Brown, certainly no conservative figure, and a governor of a state that has had a lot of experience with this issue, recently expressed his concern about the issue of legalizing marijuana under any circumstances when he did an appearance on Meet the Press. I'm sure that you're aware that Democrat Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz just spoke out and was attacked by the proponents of Amendment 2. She expressed her concerns as a mother and as a cancer survivor about how far-reaching this amendment is and the loopholes in it. And former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, that we work very closely with, who is a former addict, once supported this legalization issue and now realizes it was a terrible mistake. So we share the concerns of folks like this. And clearly, this isn't a political issue. I'm about as unpolitical a creature as you will find. Democrats, Republicans, people from all walks of life are concerned about it. Floridians really need to consider the enormity of what we're considering with this constitutional amendment. Not a bill, but a constitutional amendment. They really need to look at the numbers. There have been poll questions asked, as I'm sure you are aware, but unfortunately the poll questions don't really delve into the reality of what we're dealing with. I find that when I talk to people and they find out what this amendment really consists of, and as sure Judd said, frequently people have not read it, but when they read it and understand what it says, they're very concerned about it, and their views change very quickly as a result. So if you haven't read it, I encourage each and every one of you to read it. I'd also like for you to consider the fiscal analysis that was done back in November by the Department of Health. If you've not read that, I encourage you to get a copy and to read it, because they estimate in there that we will have, if this amendment passes, about 412,000 marijuana recipients, people that would be authorized to use under the guise of medicine, 250,000 personal caregivers that would be authorized to administer the marijuana, and about 1,800 shops to sell the marijuana. And then they further state in their analysis that they plan on only having a grand total of 13 regional inspectors to oversee all of this, using 10 cars and 10 tablets. Think about that a minute. 13 inspectors, 10 cars, and 10 tablets for this enormous system that would be put in place, and the number of people that would be using, and the number of pot shops that would exist to dispense, because it will not be dispensed through pharmacies. It cannot be. We are literally looking at an unleashing of a wild, wild west of potent marijuana products, including edibles, with inadequate resources to oversee it if this amendment goes through. The 412,000 recipients would be able to get marijuana for any other condition, that's in the language of the amendment, that they can get a physician to authorize them to use for. And if you just look at the history of what we've gone through with pill mills, you can imagine that it would be the same type of doctors making those recommendations. There is no prescription. Marijuana cannot be prescribed. It is simply a recommendation. With the 250,000 caregivers that would be authorized, they're not required by the amendment to have any medical training, to be related to their patient, or to have any kind of certifications or background checks. So they literally could be drug dealers that are administering this so-called medicine. They also could be people that are addicted. And then the 1,800 marijuana shops that are predicted will not be pharmacies. They don't have to be overseen by medical or pharmaceutical professionals. Already, I'm sure you're aware, there are investors all over the state right now and entrepreneurs that are positioning themselves to make money off of this issue. And they're doing this without any regard to how drugs destroy families, destroy communities, and destroy lives. Think about it a minute. 13 inspectors, 10 cars, and 10 tablets to manage this monster of a system that would be in place for the number of people that would be using. I would suggest that Floridians need to back up a little bit, take a breath, and really think this thing through, because this will forever change our constitution in our state. It's very difficult to go back and fix things that you do with a constitutional amendment. And believe me, there are many, many flaws in here that would need to be fixed. So I thank you for your attention and for covering this very important issue.
My name is Karen Bailey. I'm from Ocala, Florida. And in September of 2011, I lost my son to a drug overdose. He was a typical homegrown Florida boy who admired Bobby Bowden, Tony Dungy, and Tim Tebow. He had a huge heart and enjoyed playing football, wakeboarding on the lake, and riding four-wheelers in the mud. Unfortunately, he also enjoyed smoking pot. Marijuana can lead a person to experiment with more dangerous drugs. While this isn't always the case, sadly, it was the case with my son. In one of the last conversations I had with him, he shared with me that his addiction to prescription pills has started with marijuana. He told me that he began initially smoking pot because it lowered his inhibitions in social settings. He then fell into the habit of taking pills to maintain the buzz he got from marijuana. Those pills became an addiction he could not control, and ultimately it took his precious life. During the last 9 months of my son's life, he was sober for 5 of them. Marijuana had a significant role in the relapse of his addiction. As harmless as he thought it was the beginning of his end. My family understands that our children are our biggest asset, and we owe it to them to ensure they have a chance at a bright future. I have seen and lived with the damage marijuana can do. Saying no to legalizing marijuana in Florida does not make us a less compassionate or loving state. It is out of love for our children, for those like my son, that we need to say no. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kent Runyon. I'm the Executive Director of Novus Medical Detox. And in my profession, unfortunately, I have to hear stories like this all too often. And I have to tell you, the reason I'm here today is two-part. One, my profession, which has over 25 years have been working with persons in social service settings who have been suffering from addiction, homeless veterans, persons returning to the community from prison, women who've been victims of trauma and victimization. But more importantly, the reason I'm here today is as a father. I'm the father of three. I've been blessed to have them reach their 20s and was blessed to most recently see my son graduate from college. And I have to tell you that it's been my experience that marijuana is not an innocent drug. I frequently hear from patients that I've worked with and persons over the years tell me that marijuana was absolutely a gateway drug. And I frequently hear people who are misled who believe that marijuana is not addictive. That's not true. In fact, studies show that 1 in 6 children who play with marijuana will become addicted to it. And by definition, it absolutely is addictive. When you cannot stop on your own and it contributes to life quality problems, it's an addiction. I have to tell you that the whole idea in this legislation that you can get it without a prescription is a severe concern to me. I think of my son when he was 18 years old in college. Had he fallen and broken his arm, he would have gone to a doctor, potentially, and received the ability to go get marijuana to deal with the discomfort from his broken arm. And he could have done all that without me being involved or being aware whatsoever. And he wouldn't have gone to a pharmacy to get the marijuana. He would have gone to a marijuana dispensary where he would have received some amount of marijuana with very limited direction on how to use that marijuana or when to stop using that marijuana or how to stop using that marijuana. That's what this legislation permits in our state, is for our children to have this access. And then that makes me wonder, we all know that marijuana is a huge problem already among our children and youth, but I can only imagine how much more access our youth and our children will have to marijuana if this legislation passes. And we know, studies are clear, that the earlier that our children begin using marijuana, the more severe the consequences is that use. Impacts on school accomplishment, and even more concern, there's direct correlation that it can be relate to schizophrenia and psychosis and mental health difficulties in their life. So my appeal is to parents, grandparents, school leaders, teachers, child advocates, to do whatever it takes to promote proper education of this legislation. And as been said earlier, people need to read the legislation and see what this is about. It's not about compassionate care for persons suffering from a medical diagnosis. This is about increasing access to marijuana in a smoked form. Thank you.
And I just would like to close with a comment from Sheriff Judd before we open it up for questions, even though he's right to my right. He said before, this is not your daddy's marijuana. Some of the marijuana that we've seen from Colorado and other places is as much as 20 times more potent than it was 30 years ago. So this is not the same that we've seen back in the 60s and the 70s. This stuff is dangerous. We're monitoring stories all the time in Colorado about the effects that this more potent marijuana is having on our communities. And with this, I would like to close and open it up for questions.
Can I ask, if you could just raise your hands, who of you has read the Supreme Court ruling on this? Okay. So the way the Supreme Court handled this was they indicated that the debilitating illnesses that are enumerated in the proposed constitutional amendment will be the ones that anything similar. So nowhere does it say a kid with a broken shoulder is one of the enumerated illnesses. So how can you maintain that leap of logic here? Can you explain how you get there?
It's not a leap of logic. It's reading the constitutional amendment. I've talked to several lawyers who say that you can set up rules or regulations, but you cannot restrict the constitutional amendment. And the constitutional amendment speaks of diseases and significant diseases, as alluded to by the Supreme Court. But it goes further, and if it was truly only for medicinal purposes, why did they put or other conditions? Now, when we take that or other conditions and we relate it back to states that already have medical marijuana, such as California, we find out other conditions include things such as, I can't sleep at night, I'm under a great deal of stress, I have these cramps, I have these backaches, I have this neck ache, I have this pain from a broken arm. And by one person's analogy, and I wish I could quote it for you, I'll find it, our constitutional amendment is even more liberal than the law that was enacted in California.
But Sheriff Judd, I read the constitutional amendment before we came over here, and it appears that all of the loopholes you speak to can all be closed by the Department of Health based on the regulation the amendment says they need to implement.
You know, I disagree with that. If they wanted a constitutional amendment that was tightly written so that there wouldn't be any interpretation, then that's exactly what they would have done. This was crafted. This amendment is crafted. Why would they write amendment when they went to the effort to say, well, the caregiver has to be at least 21 years of age, okay, and can only have 5 customers at any given time. If they wanted to rely only on the regulation, why didn't they let the regulators change that? And that's what I hear from the pro-marijuana people. Oh, don't worry about that. Go ahead and buy this used car and we'll see if it's got an engine in it after you buy it. I'm telling you folks, this is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's designed to tug on the heartstrings and our compassionate side, and there's no one in the state of Florida that doesn't care for the ones that are very sick and want all the comfort for them that we can. But when we look at the data, when we look at the 100% of the people that obtained a medical marijuana recommendation in Colorado when it was medical marijuana, when we see only 6% of them were for HIV, AIDS, cancer, ALS, glaucoma, and 94% were for other conditions, makes me suspicious. When the average medical marijuana user in California is 32 years old, now don't you know that's a high sick population, 32-year-old males? It's a fraud, folks. And anybody that thinks it's anything other than that, smoking marijuana.
Sheriff, where's alcohol in this conversation? I didn't hear that word once from anybody. You talked about all these, this and that. All you got to do is be, 21 and have a valid ID, and you can drink yourself to death. Or not, nobody's talking I didn't hear the alcohol word one time.
Do you know why? It's not on the amendment in November. We're talking about Amendment 2, legalization of marijuana. We're not having a comparison here.
You're a far more dangerous drug that's legal.
So if you have the ability to get run over by a 100-mile-an-hour Chevrolet, that means we ought to go ahead and craft a 90-mile-an-hour Ford to run over you too, in the case the Chevrolet misses you?
Well, we're talking about substance abuse.
What we're talking about is Amendment 2. And Amendment 2 is on the ballot. and it's a fraud. It's being perpetuated on the caring people. I know, I'm talking to them. I looked a person in the eye who was for the medical use of marijuana to help the very sick and distressed. And when I explained Amendment 2, they said, that's nothing like what I envisioned or what I wanted. I wanted to help the very sick. Do you mean kids can get this marijuana? Oh, yeah. Do you mean that anyone 21 years of age with 5 or less customers can deliver marijuana? Oh, yeah. But you know the one we haven't talked about here, ladies and gentlemen, if we all go to the doctor and or the pharmacy and we receive a bad diagnosis or a bad medicine, we can hold our doctors or our pharmacists or our medical groups civilly liable. Why did they write in this constitutional amendment that doctors, physicians, to be specific, physicians and growers of this drug are criminally and civilly immune? You can't hold them responsible. So if you go and obtain a prescription and you find out that you become very ill and you trace it back to the grower and he says, you know, I was having trouble with those pesky Florida bugs, so I sprayed paraquat on it. And it creates an injury or illness for you. There's no civil liability to hold them liable for that. Do you think that's a problem?
Sheriff, could you walk us through how a minor could legally get marijuana if this is passed?
The way the constitutional amendment is written, it does not prohibit juveniles, minors, from obtaining marijuana. Period. It doesn't.
So the Constitution.
So the constitutional amendment doesn't.
So wouldn't it be up to the legislature to enact a law that would prevent that?
Well, there's already legislation and laws, but there's also privacy acts. And the privacy acts says that you can't discuss it. So you go to one of your pot docs, which used to be your pill doc till we put them out of business, and they have no civil or criminal liability. And they say, kid, you really could use some of this stuff. And they provide it for you. And then by law, it's confidential. And then they use it and somebody wants to hold them liable. Constitution says kids can have it. I did my evaluation. It appears that he had an other condition that worked. In fact, I talked to a Channel 9 reporter out of Orlando that did a beautiful piece that if you've not seen it, you should, where they went to California. He went in one of these medical shops to get his evaluation, and if you had trouble knowing what it was that was wrong with you that would qualify for medical marijuana, it was written on the walls. You could just tell them, number 3 there. Now, folks, my point is, we're trying to educate, and they're trying to say, well, this is medicine for the sick. No, it's not. No, it's not, because your physician, your normal physicians are not going to prescribe this if it passes first. Because why? They're not going to prescribe it because they can't prescribe it. They can only do a recommendation. And if you get this recommendation, you can't go down to a renowned pharmacy like we all have to see certified and educated pharmacists for this medicine because it's illegal. So physicians who the AMA and the Florida Medical Association says no medical purposes in a smoked form, they're not going to give you a prescription. You can't go to the pharmacy to get it. So that exits out of the medicine world for those of us who know better. Dig down, ladies and gentlemen. Go back to the communities that you cover and ask your local law enforcement agencies to tell you how many arrests they do for domestic violence, for abuse of the children, for failure to take care of their families, and see how many are tied to marijuana. And that's what I look at. It's easy for us to vote for something and walk away from it. And after all, we're not responsible for managing it. We're not responsible for the social fallout. We're not responsible for the families such as this lady here, whose child dies as a direct relationship to the gateway drug that started it all. We're not responsible for that, so heck, why should we worry?
Why?
Well, the Florida sheriffs do.
Can I ask a question?
Ask anything.
Why does your organization support the regulatory structure that the Florida legislature put on the Charlotte's Web legislation, yet you do not have the faith in the Florida legislature to also enact, if this is passed, something similar that would be a closely regulated industry in this state?
This is not going to be a closely regulated industry.
Why do you? How can you say that with such clarity?
Well, I can show you. I believe it's either Oregon or Washington. Everyone on the regulatory board are pro-marijuana. So
this is going to be a corrupt amendment that's sanctioned by the Florida legislature, equally corrupt.
The Florida legislature has not sanctioned this constitutional amendment.
It hasn't, but if it passes, it will go to the legislature to set up a regulatory structure.
If they were interested in this being a tightly wound constitutional amendment, they've been the supporters of the amendment. If they truly meant it for medical purposes, why didn't they just write it that way?
Sheriff, those proponents suggest this is a reefer madness campaign, much like was conducted in the 30s. Your thoughts?
I wasn't around in the 30s. That's about the only decade I wasn't around, by the way, now.
But it is a parade of horribles is what the reefer madness film did.
Well, let me suggest to you that every day you come to work, and y'all cover the kinds of stuff we deal with, but the average person comes to work, works really hard, goes home, takes care of their family, pays their bills, takes the kids to Little League or to ballet or church on Sunday. I see the social problems of this. I see the challenges. I see the guy that's up all night with a baby that's screaming, so he smokes him a blunt and a half and he thinks that'll help and ends up bouncing the baby off the walls. I see the deputy that has to take the gun from the guy who is passed out as a result of having marijuana and other drugs in his or her possession. That's who I worry about. I can tell you clearly, and to get back to your statement about Charlotte's Web, the Florida Sheriff's Association supported the Charlotte's Web and the Florida legislature because it's not smoked, operative words, and it is tightly regulated and designed to do further research and to help a specific issue or illness. We are not categorically saying that there is anecdotal evidence, not research evidence. There's anecdotal evidence that this seems to help some people. Our statement is this is an amendment about smoked marijuana, calling it medicine. You can't even control the dosage. You can't control the dosage with any medicine that's in a smoked form. So at the end of the day, we just want the people to know what it is. And then when they vote for it, we work for the people of the state of Florida. We will respect their vote and do the best we can.
Now, the state of Colorado is in the process of passing, or if they haven't, I understand they're in the process of doing it, of labeling and requiring the THC dosage on every marijuana sample that's sold. What's to prevent Florida from learning from other states and regulating it that tightly?
I certainly believe that Florida should learn from other states. And one of the ways they can learn from other states is to consider that in November, that maybe we ought to wait until this social research being conducted by other states has more definitive outcomes. And the question is, why didn't Colorado deal with this on the front end before a kid overdosed and jumped to his death? Why did a child have to die? Well, I wake up every morning trying to figure out how to stop children from dying.